Everything stops. Screens go dark. Trading tickers freeze mid-surge. The conference call that had been a river of numbers and clipped advice falls into an uncomfortable, breathless quiet. Outside, the market feed stutters. Inside, the empire Richard Sterling built feels suddenly hollow, exposed beneath bright glass and marble. Richard paces. His suit is impeccable, his panic is not. He keeps asking the same question to anyone who will stay in the room long enough. How long? How much? His voice tightens around figures. Millions, contracts, deadlines. Every answer is a guess. Every guess makes him more urgent. "You don't understand," he says once, to no one in particular. "If this drags on, it's not just money. It's confidence. It's everything we stand for." They bring in the best, outside consultants with silver hair and sharper resumes, a small army of engineers and lawyers. David Chen, the lead external specialist, moves through the server-lit corridors like someone cataloging a crime scene. He speaks in measured sentences about containment and investigation. Marcus Thompson, the company's chief technology officer, stands by a bank of helpless monitors, chin-tucked, face unreadable. He answers questions with calm precision and just as often with silence. The boardroom simmers with blame. Fingers hover near names. The cameras are on. Investors call. Messages flood into Richard's phone faster than anyone can read. For a man accustomed to controlling outcomes by sheer force of will, losing the rhythm of the building feels like having his hands tied. Outside the glass walls, the staff watch from their desks as if the building is a living thing under anesthesia. In the ranks below, people whisper about layoffs, about contracts evaporating like mist. The janitors keep working, broom handles tapping a hollow rhythm against polished floors, as if asserting small certainties where the big ones have failed. Upstairs, in a private study that overlooks the city, a 12-year-old girl sits on a couch with a laptop that has always seemed too small for the size of her thoughts. Her name is Sofia Mendoza. The word adopted is a tight, simple label that appears on many forms. Legal papers, a glossy profile at the philanthropy gala, where cameras once tilted toward her smile. But it does not capture the full texture of her life. She was born to Maria and Carlos Mendoza in a neighborhood where pride was a quiet thing and ambition wore sensible shoes. Her earliest lessons were learned at the kitchen table, between the clang of pots and the hush of late-night homework. A father teaching her multiplication on scraps of receipts, a mother who balanced bills and encouragement with the same gentle hand. Carlos scrubbed floors in Richard Sterling's towers, the same building that later gave Sophia a different address. He wiped coffee from the CEO's conference table and later, because he could not help it, passed along a book about numbers to the little girl who loved puzzles. When Richard first noticed Sophia, it was because she had fixed a classroom projector with a paperclip and a focused stare that made the teacher look twice. He had been there for a donation event, the usual ribbon cutting and camera angles, and found himself staying longer than etiquette required. He watched as she turned what to others was a broken thing into a simple, elegant solution. Something about that day stayed with him. He invited her to the company's youth program. He offered mentorship. He promised opportunity. In time, the mentorship became guardianship, and guardianship became adoption. On paper, Richard Sterling became her father. In practice, the arrangement was never quite that tidy. At home, on Tuesday nights and Sunday mornings, and whenever she needed grounding, Sophia returned to the house that smelled like cinnamon and oil, where Carlos and Maria still lived. Carlos remained a constant, part mentor, part father, part storyteller who taught her the dignity of honest labor. Maria kept the recipes she had always loved and the way she smoothed Sophia's hair when midnight anxiety crept in. Sophia wore both worlds without apology, the polished hallways of the high-rise and the small humming pride of the block below. She knew the rhythm of a boardroom and the cadence of a broom. She understood how privilege could build bridges and close doors at the same time. People in suits noticed the cool, composed 12-year-old who could, quote, stock indices but not the muscles in Carlos's hands. People in the building's maintenance wings noticed the same girl bending over math problems on her kitchen counter as simply another neighbor's child. In both places, her intelligence was visible. In both places, it was underestimated. Now the empire he had invited her into was faltering. Richard, who had once handed her keys and access badges with a casual benevolence, now held on to power the way someone clings to the only lifeline in a storm. He muttered policies and timelines and contingency plans. He leaned on experts because he needed hands he trusted, but trust is a brittle thing when everyone is exhausted. At her feet, the laptop screen shows the same dark frieze that hangs over the rest of the company. Numbers are a language. She reads the way others read a book. She watches the technicians move like fish in a glass tank, quick and agitated, and sees that their panic is not purely technical. It smells of something else, of calculation, of a pressure being deliberately applied. She is not an engineer. She's not a consultant. She is, however, very good at noticing patterns where others see noise. Her mind assembles quiet parallels. Marcus, despite being competent, prefers closed rooms and private keys. He often brushes off junior staff with a sigh that tastes like impatience. The same man who led a full staff meeting 2 months ago had, in a way that had unsettled her, dismissed Carlos with a clipped comment when the janitor tried to suggest a maintenance window change. Marcus had the entree to certain servers that others did not, the kind of access that makes a heart beat when you consider what just happened. Sophia reads the room like a book, and reads too, the small things no one else will notice, who asks for logs and who asks for silence, which names get redacted in memos. A curt sentence in an internal chat that is oddly smug in the middle of an emergency. She watches David Chen in a corridor, the specialist who speaks of protocol, like a hymn. Beside him, Marcus gestures in a way meant to comfort, but the fingers curl too comfortably around technical ownership. He is polished and polite. He's also worn with an impatience that, when the world is collapsing, takes on the color of something else. They move through the day like a chorus, singing wrong notes. Richard paces. The board rations him statements. Investors call to shout, to threaten. The employees look at one another and, beneath the official concern, fear that the invisible hand that has always guided careers and promotions might now fold up and disappear. Sophia stands up and walks to the glass wall. The city beyond is a grid of lights and in different motion. The world feels big and small at the same time. Vast stakes in small hands. She is still a child in the eyes of many around her. She is not small. That evening, the company sets up an emergency command center under flickering LED strips. Most of the adults move like soldiers on a map, carrying tablets and expertise. They chain the night to briefings and coffee. Marcus gives a few interviews to a ROI consultant who had shown up, his answers clipped and carefully prepared. He offers calm where there is none. Sophia slips into the perimeter of the work. Her presence is tolerated, sometimes patronized, often ignored. She carries with her legitimacy a set of credentials that comes from being Richard's daughter. Staff let her past with a shrug, because in corporate spaces, access is a currency and her name buys passage. She uses it not to flaunt, but to learn. She moves through the aisles lined with humming units and stacked racks of servers the way a child moves through a room of toys she has learned to handle with respect. When the lights finally dim in the server corridor and the real work begins, Sophia acts on instincts born from afternoons hunched at a kitchen table, poring over problems until a pattern emerges. She traces the chaos the way a reader follows a mystery. She looks for the small choices, the offhand deletions, the ambiguous timestamps, the messages that say, "leave it," when the evidence clearly needs preserving. She finds a window in a monitoring feed, a quiet trail of admin messages that point to deliberate interference, not accident. The technical terms are not for her to dissect. Instead, she sees the human shape behind them. A login that came from a set of credentials tied to Marcus's account pops up in an audit trail. There are drafts of emails, queued with sign-offs, that suggest a plan to advertise a catastrophe for gain. There is an oddness in the digital signature, a redundancy that smells like someone trying to create plausible deniability. Sophia does something the specialists did not expect. She follows the human logic beyond the logs. She remembers moments from months earlier. A lunch where Marcus laughed quietly at a rumor about the board. A conversation in which he had spoken about necessary cleansings in the company. She remembers Carlos telling her once, in a voice thick with the kind of patience only those who labor long learn, "They talk and they forget that someone has to keep the lights on." She collects, at first in her mind and then in a folder she makes on the laptop, the evidence that maps motive to method. It is not glamorous. There are emails with calculated allowances for chaos, notes promising new revenue channels when market panic would depress competition. There are attachments that make sense only in a context of inside knowledge. She takes screenshots, harmless captures of what she sees, kept as a record rather than as a tool to reverse anything. She does not tinker with active systems. She is careful in her steps. Her father figure taught her to leave a place in better condition than she found it. Outside the server room, someone comments to a colleague that the company will never be the same. Inside, Sophia's fingers hover. She is a child who has learned adult restraint. She tracks a line of communication that looks like it traveled from Marcus to an external account with a pattern of opportunistic timing. The name is a cipher. Beyond the cipher is a human calculation, cause chaos, buy assets on the cheap, profit when trust crumbles. She imagines deals being signed with cold hands, the kind of contracts where lives and livelihoods are footnotes. At midnight, when most of the building has given into fatigue, she walks the quiet corridors on her way back to the study she keeps at Richard's place. The cleaning crew nods to Carlos as he passes. A security guard gives her a tired smile. In the city, life goes on. Distant horns and a bus's muffled sigh. She thinks of the lives depending on the systems humming in racks below. They are not faceless lines in a spreadsheet. They are the teachers whose grants depend on payments, the nurses who rely on payroll, the families in suburbs who wait for rent checks. Billion-dollar consequences have human faces. That night she speaks with Carlos in the small kitchen where they have shared 100 conversations. He pours tea with a hand that remembers a dozen different kinds of work. He doesn't ask what she saw, he just listens as she speaks. She tells him about patterns, about instinct, about a login that smelled wrong. He nods, not surprised that she notices, but solemn because he understands how the world sometimes punishes those who point out inconvenient truths. "You remember to breathe," he tells her, as he has told her since she was small. "Not everything you find has to be fought today." Her answers are short. In the marrow of the night, she feels something like certainty uncoiling. If this is sabotage, it will get worse. If Marcus is behind it, he will hide behind authority until someone forces him out into daylight. If she wants to protect the people who will be hurt, she will have to put her evidence in a place where it cannot be swept under a polished rug. She does not sleep. Instead, she opens the laptop again and prepares a record that is not a weapon, but a mirror. In those hours, the building breathes in and out, data centers shedding heat like a sleeping animal. She writes down a timeline in plain sentences. What happened when, who said what, which access points lit up and at what times. She includes copies of the messages that cannot be explained away. She marks, in handwriting that feels steady and small, a single note. Tomorrow at 9, the board will hold an emergency all hands. At dawn, the building's employees shuffle in like witnesses at a courthouse. The atmosphere is sterile and humming with a new kind of vigilance. People who had the luxury of a weekend to forget urgency are now here because the issue did not stop when the sun rose. Richard appears at the front of the room looking raw in a way he has never allowed cameras to capture. There is an earnestness in his eyes, a vulnerability that the international press would later describe as unexpected. He begins to speak about resilience, about values, about responsibility. He offers thanks to teams who had worked through the night. He offers no definitive answers because there are none yet. Behind him, a bank of monitors remain dark, the main display that would ordinarily cycle through dashboards a mute promise. David Chen is there. Marcus stands at the back with his arms folded, lips pressed into that expression of controlled authority. The executives hold their breaths as if the building itself is waiting for a sign. Sophia walks in toward the center of the room. She feels the weight of attention as if it were a physical thing pressing on her shoulders. Heads turn, some with curiosity, some with a thin thread of judgment. The rumor that the boss's daughter might do something ripples along the rows. She's aware of the looks that reduce her, too young, too privileged, uncertain. Those are the kinds of things people say when they are afraid to be wrong about power. She carries a folder, not the leather briefcase of the seasoned executive, but a simple blue folder that contains what she has found: timestamps, messages, a series of administrative records. It is a physical, tangible thing that contrasts with the vapor of speculation floating through the room. She will not throw accusations. She will not attempt to deliver justice in a courtroom. She will present evidence, measured and human, and let the systems, both legal and corporate, move. At a table near the front, Marcus catches her eye. His look is calm but not blind. For a second, she thinks he might smile. Instead, his expression settles into practiced neutrality. He has been here before, and he knows how a room of people listens when it is fed confidence. He will not show fear until he must. Sophia steps forward. The lights feel brighter than usual. She sets the folder on the table and opens her laptop. The room waits. Her voice is steady, the voice of a child tempered by nights of study and the quiet belief that facts are stubborn things. "I don't have answers to everything," she says. "But I followed numbers and conversations. I followed access. Here is what I found." She explains, in plain language, the timeline she recorded. When the disruptions began, the odd sequences in administrative logs, the messages that suggested opportunism. She points to an email draft with a closed subject line and a clear intent. She reads passages that are devoid of technical detail but rich in motive. She reveals a small technical artifact, a sign-in trace linked to Marcus's credentials during Windows when only a few people would have been able to access certain systems. The room reacts in a dozen tiny waves. Some faces slowly go pale, others are skeptical, the reflex of those who have seen accusations dissolve under scrutiny. David Chen, chairing the emergency board, looks at her now with a measure of respect that has the edge of surprise, the kind of respect that comes when someone underestimates you and you remove the comfort of that error. Marcus turns, slowly. He asks her a question, careful, intended to disarm. "What are you suggesting, Sophia?" he says, his voice low and steady. There is a decency to the phrasing that tries to protect his position and the company's reputation. Sophia looks him in the eye. She could be afraid. She is not. "There's evidence of internal interference," she says simply. "Not an accident. Someone with authority created the conditions for this." A murmur moves through the room. Richard's jaw tightens into a line that is familiar. He is both the man who had given her an education and the man who must now face the possibility that he had been wrong about someone he trusted. He scans the faces, the rows of staff, the bank of empty monitors. The idea that the enemy was within lodges like a cold stone in his chest. David raises his hand and calls for order. He requests that the IT team provide a readout. Marcus volunteers to walk them through the steps he'd taken overnight. His tone is impeccable. He explains triage and containment and contingency in a way the room is meant to hear as competence. But there is an edge to his answers now, a defensive precision that, for some, feels like a shield too carefully wrapped. Sophia's folder remains open on the desk like a small altar. In it, among the documents, is one item that is quieter than the rest. A drafted message from Marcus to an external party, a sentence that implied someone was ready to buy the company's assets post-adjustment. It is not a smoking gun in the legal sense, just a thread in a net, but the net is widening. As the board asks for more time to verify, an assistant enters the room with a message that changes the tenor of everything. There was a scheduled purge, an automated job queued in a system that would, if allowed to continue, delete archived backups across several data centers at dawn. The room lunges at the possibility as if at a true calamity. Panic and procedure jostle in the same space. Sophia's heart clutches. She had seen traces of something timed, something designed to become permanent. She had been careful, but she now understands the stakes in a new, sharper way. If a purge runs to completion, they will lose not just live data, but the very records that would allow investigators to reconstruct motive and method. David turns to Marcus, whose face has hardened. "Who authorized that?" he asks. Marcus's answer is a practiced thing. He says, with the kind of cool that people mistake for innocence, that it had been an emergency rollback scheduled by system administrators to prevent cascading corruption. He avoids naming names in a way that is deliberate, leaving space for doubt. In the back of the room, someone whispers a rumor. Perhaps the rollback was a legitimate emergency measure. Someone else whispers that it's odd for a rollback to be triggered without cross-checks. The air tightens. Sophia thinks of all the people whose paychecks rely on this company running smoothly. She thinks of Maria counting pennies, of Carlos coming home with paint on his cuffs from a day of work, of the man who stacks chairs in the cafeteria and remembers faces better than names. She thinks of the children whose scholarships and grants are managed by systems now at risk. She stands and says, quietly but without apology, "If that purge runs, we will lose evidence. If we lose the evidence, we won't be able to show how this happened. We need to preserve copies now." Her words hang in the air, simple and clear. They are the kind of moral clarity that forces action. David nods. Richard's nod is less certain but still a nod. Marcus draws a breath as if to argue, but the room has moved already. The priority becomes preservation rather than blame. They work in a flurry of new purpose. Teams mobilize to create read-only snapshots and to duplicate archives. Professionals who had been flailing earlier now channel their panic into concrete motion. They follow checklists and scripts that are not for public viewing. The lights in the room feel less ominous. For a moment, the machine-laden building seems on course again. That's when a junior technician approaches Sophia, eyes wide and voice halting. He says he found a message in a hidden thread that mentions a buyer willing to move if leadership uncertainty could be manufactured. The message is unsigned, but time-stamped during the outage window. The technician's face matches the gravity of this moment. He has scanned his conscience and decided to speak. Sophia flips through the folder, feeling for continuity. The pieces click into a shape she recognizes now. Man with motive, access at odd times, messages suggesting opportunism, a purge that would erase the paper trail. The threads bind into a story frighteningly plausible. Marcus watches, hands in his jacket pockets. He says nothing. Others in the room begin to look at him with suspicion, finally allowing themselves to ask the questions that had been murmured in corners. The look in Richard's eyes shifts. He is not blind to the possibility of betrayal. Before the room can decide on an immediate course beyond preservation, a guard rushes in, breathless, holding a small device. "Security," he says. "There's a breach in the north wing. Someone's trying to tail the internal network. The sentence cuts off as everyone turns toward the door, toward an alarm that blinks red like a pulse. Marcus strides forward with a practiced authority that is less about concern and more about control. Sophia feels something cold ripple through her chest. She had followed patterns and noticed motives. She had taken care to preserve evidence. She had done everything she could to keep the truth intact. But the night is not yet won. There are moves to be made by people with authority and temperament very different from hers. In the hallway, someone shouts. Security radios crackle. The monitors in the room briefly flicker. The main display, once mute, shows a single line of text that does not belong to any scheduled feed. It is a short, almost obscene message. "Watch them fall." The room falls into a hush that feels like a held breath. Marcus searches the faces of the room as if guessing at a traitor's expression. Richard's jaw tightens until a vein stands out. Across the rows, staffers whisper about someone who knows too much, someone who might try to silence inconvenient witnesses. Sophia stands still under the light. In her folder, a line of evidence glows like a beacon in an otherwise dark sea. She knows she cannot be the only one who has noticed. She knows she's a child in a room of adults who will resent being told how to act by someone so young. She also knows something else. The truth is stubborn and it wants to be seen. She moves toward the nearest terminal, fingers poised not to erase but to anchor. She is thinking 2 moves ahead, preserve, present, and then force the institution to reckon with the facts. Already, Marcus's posture has hardened into something defensive. He will not go quietly if the spotlight turns on him. As security radios scream and the monitors flicker, Sophia hears the building itself respond. The low whir of cooling fans, the distant clank of a door being secured, footsteps like the approach of inevitability. The stakes, for all the money and the sheen, distill into a single vulnerable thing. Who will bear the cost when power is used to hide harm? She breathes and looks at Richard, who meets her eyes with a question she has seen before, not about competence, but about trust. He had chosen to make her his daughter, to open the doors he could. Now the door to the truth stands open, and he must decide how far he will go to follow it. Outside, the city keeps moving, ignorant of the drama in the glass tower. Inside, a group of people gather around a small altar of evidence and resolve. The moment is raw and loaded. It is the space where a child's quiet courage might collide with decades of established power. If you like true underdog stories, subscribe and join us as we follow what happens next. Someone in the room receives a private message and, with a face of slow, dawning disbelief, whispers a new name, one none of them expected to hear. Marcus's eyes flick toward the doorway as footsteps approach, each one a metronome counting down to a confrontation no one is yet prepared to finish. Footsteps, not the measured tread of the executive, but the precise, deliberate pace of someone who carries authority like a badge. The door swings open, and a woman in a plain suit enters with 2 officers behind her. Her face is all economy and focus. Agent Johnson, FBI, the badge says when she steps forward, moves through the room with the kind of quiet the room had not expected. She has been summoned because the outage left a trail that reached beyond corporate walls. Suspicious trading patterns, flagged external transfers, and a vendor who had alerted regulators after a strange offer arrived tied to the company's turmoil. She listens for less than a minute. Then she says, without malice, without theater, "We need to see everything you pulled from the system. Now." Her voice is an instruction that turns talking into motion. David Chen meets her look and hands over a stack of sealed drives. They are the physical copies the teams had made when preservation became urgent. The drives are labeled in plain handwriting: snapshots, archives, audit readouts. Agent Johnson nods and hands them to her specialist. Her eyes flick to the banked monitors and to the blue folder on the table, then to the girl standing in the center of a room that suddenly feels both too small and exactly the right size. She crosses the distance in 3 steps. "You spoke with them?" she asks of Sophia, softer now. "I did," Sophia answers. Her voice is steady. She's small in the range of shoulders around her, but the steadiness is real. "I followed access. I preserved copies." Agent Johnson studies her, then says what the room needed to hear. "Good. We'll need to catalog everything, and we'll need statements." There is a legal machinery settling on the room, like a careful hand. The murmurs fall into a new register: protocol, statements, custody. For the first time since dawn, most people listen instead of speaking. Marcus watches from the back, with a face like a man who has been interrupted in the middle of a rehearsal. He had assumed rehearsals would go on uninterrupted. He had not planned for a child to direct the music. Agent Johnson asks for Marcus's credentials. Marcus produces them with a calm that was engineered to survive scrutiny. She takes a copy and then another, her gestures crisp. She asks for a timeline of actions taken overnight. Marcus provides a confident narrative about containment. He frames decisions as necessity. He frames omissions as oversight. He is practiced at shaping perception. Sophia steps forward again. She does not accuse. She lays a single sheet of paper on the table and opens her laptop. The main display, previously a mute wall of black, flickers to life. It is simple, a mirrored playback of a chain of correspondence. No technical jargon is displayed, only the human words that reveal motive. The headline reads, in plain terms, what the room had been fearing: planned opportunism, time to exploit panic. The monitors begin to cycle. A thread of emails appears. Drafts with a recipient masked, a sentence that refers to market correction opportunities, and a timestamp that places the message in a window when Marcus had privileged access. An internal memo appears, unsigned but precise in its implications. A purge scheduled to reset archived storage. The room watches line by line as motive and method slide into view. These are not encrypted puzzles. They are human decisions, written as people write when they want to hide intent in administrative language. David moves to the console. He clicks through the preservation set. There is a clean, forensic copy of admin logs, presented as a readout, not a lecture, the kind of evidence that shows presence without teaching anyone how to create it. Agent Johnson leans in, reading a timestamp as if reading a face. The evidence places account activity in Marcus's credentials, at times he claimed to be elsewhere. A trail of correspondence leads outward to a brokerage alias that had been trying to pick up assets at a discount. The room goes quiet enough that someone could hear fingers tapping a watch. Marcus's mouth moves. He offers a line about coincidences, about misattributed sessions. He suggests that credentials could be used by others. His language, now defensive, is precise and practiced. He's a man who once controlled the narrative. Now he's the subject of it. "It's not the first time," an engineer mutters. Small voice, too tired for gossip, but large enough for someone to notice. There were warnings that never made it to the right ears. Richard's face is a map of decisions. He watches Marcus, then looks at Sophia. He sees the girl he had chosen to bring into his life. He sees the other life she carries in the crease of her voice, in the way she speaks of timestamps like they were living things. He had offered her keys. Now those keys have opened something he did not want to see. Agent Johnson rises and addresses the room with the kind of clarity that leaves no space for spin. "We will take custody of the preserved copies," she says. "We will interview those who can explain the chain of actions. In the meantime, we're going to secure the premises. Nobody leaves without clearance." Marcus steps toward the edge of the podium as if to claim space. His motion is small, but it shifts the air. He does not expect to be interrupted. He expects to steer. He has an advantage that is both practical and psychological. He knows how to command a room. He uses that advantage to reach for Sophia's laptop as if to show he is not afraid. He says, "You'll want to be careful about jumping to conclusions. These prints can be faked." The insult is not about technique. It is about casting doubt, about weaponizing the room's fear. It is a last-ditch attempt to return the script to a safer, older pattern. The trusted man deflects the accusation. But Agent Johnson is not that old pattern. She meets his eyes and says, "We will verify everything. That's why you're not leaving." Marcus lunges, not with a weapon, but with the hand of a man who refuses to be bound by a conference room. He reaches for the laptop in a move that is more about reclaiming control than about evidence. Security reacts. It is quick, precise. A guard intercepts, but Marcus struggles, his free hand swinging toward the table. In the chaos, he knocks a low monitor. The screen fractures with a black spiderweb. Sophia stands her ground. She does not flinch. Someone behind her voices alarm as Marcus attempts to snatch the folder. His fingers close on paper. He will not be allowed to leave. Security moves in, a tight, controlled force that pins his arms without breaking bones. Marcus kicks out, more theater than danger, and the officers step in to restrain him. One of them holds him down with the measured force of someone who has seen this before. "You're under arrest," Agent Johnson states. The room hears it as a verdict pronounced by gravity. Marcus's face crumples with a sudden private panic. He shouts things, denials, accusations, slurs that flash like a sputter and then die. When language crosses into cruelty, the room's patience ends. Someone in the back calls out the small indignities he had levied, dismissive comments about staff, a recorded remark about cleaning house that earlier seemed like a metaphor and now rings like confession. He is led out with hands cuffed and mouth still arguing. The hallway doors close with a bump that feels like a punctuation mark. There is no dramatic confessing, no cinematic outburst. There is the quieter truth. A man who had believed himself untouchable now is touchable by law and by consequence. In the aftershock, the monitors flicker back to life. David and his team work to restore live operations, now with a forensic team behind them and Agent Johnson's specialists cataloging every change. Step by careful step, systems come back. It is not a miracle. It is a procedure. A combination of captured snapshots and careful reconstitution that returns service to clients and, more importantly, preserves records of what had been manipulated. Richard stands at the front and watches as the people he had entrusted with the company's pulse work to get it beating smoothly again. There is a line that moves between him and Sophia, a small measure of mutual recognition. He had given her opportunities. He had believed in the world's benevolence. He had not considered its capacity for betrayal. Now reality is teaching him the size of his oversight. He calls a second emergency meeting, this time one that is not just for triage but for reckoning. The board sits, their faces showing the kind of fatigue that comes from too many late nights and too little clarity. Richard speaks with a voice that is not performed. He does not hide his discomfort. "I chose to bring someone into my life who could see things I had missed," he says, "and I failed to listen when it mattered. We will make changes." He announces immediate, concrete steps. Marcus is no longer in charge of the technology group pending investigation. An independent oversight committee will be formed to review security and governance. There will be protections for whistleblowers and faster channels for escalation. He names the first member of the oversight committee, David Chen, and appoints 3 independent directors from reputable firms to sit on it. He offers to fund an internal education program for staff and their children, with a seed grant that will be matched by the company's philanthropic arm. He talks not about words, but about budgets, roles, and timelines. He looks at Carlos in the crowd. Carlos, who's wearing a jacket with a janitorial logo and whose hands still bear the faint lines of work. And he does something Richard had not practiced. He says, publicly and specifically, "Carlos, we were wrong to ignore you. We want your perspective on how to make this right." Carlos rises, slow and dignified. He speaks with the same plain compassion he has always used at the kitchen table. "We all do our best," he says. "We all get tired. But when someone notices, you don't push them away. You listen." Richard hears it. The change is, in part, symbolic. He elevates Carlos to a role he did not expect, head of facilities and a community liaison, with a clear mandate and compensation that reflects the responsibility. He announces a scholarship fund in Sophia's name for children of staff, and a mentorship program that pairs executives with employees from maintenance, custodial, and administrative teams to ensure upward mobility. He promises a review of promotion practices and a new channel for grievances that reports directly to the Oversight Committee, bypassing structures that had allowed silencing. Some in the room clap, others are skeptical, some weep. The emotions are raw and varied. For many staff, it is the first time someone at the top had not only listened but acted. For Sophia, it is an affirmation not of her fame or her adoption, but of the bridge she had always been, the girl who belonged at both tables. In the days that follow, the investigation deepens. Agent Johnson and her team pull preserved logs, trace external connections, and interview those implicated. Prosecutors and compliance officers sift through the preserved copies. Marcus's motives come into focus: a vision of personal gain, a bitter belief in short-term fixes at the cost of other people's lives, and a pride that turned to contempt for those he regarded as expendable. The evidence is not a single dramatic document, but a trail of choices, drafts, and conversations that together build a case. He pleads ignorance at first, then tries to bargain. The law responds with the patient mechanics of inquiry. The company's public response is careful. Richard accepts interviews that are unsparing. He acknowledges his blind spots and speaks about the work to make the company safer for everyone. He insists that the company's culture change will be measured by policy and practice, not just speeches. He announces the formation of a trust to fund education for staff children and pledges his personal time to mentor young people in the program. He wraps those announcements in the language of accountability and then steps back to let the structures make the change real. Sophia refuses the limelight. She attends strategy meetings, yes, and she sits on the newly formed youth advisory board, but she insists the work be about the people who keep the building running: the cafeteria workers, the custodians, the clerks. She speaks up for pay adjustments, for scheduling fair practices, for better channels to report suspicious activity. She insists, gently but firmly, that dignity be part of any reform package. In a town hall weeks later, Richard introduces a set of reforms in a meeting streamed to tens of thousands of employees. The camera lingers on Carlos as Richard names him head of operations for facilities. The crew from the janitorial team cheers. Some wipe tears away. For others, it is the kind of victory that arrives with practical consequences: safety equipment budgets, wage reassessments, tuition matches. It is not spectacular in the way headlines crave, but it is durable. There are awkward moments: board members who grumble and then adapt, executives who must relearn how to hear from the lower ranks. There are disputes over language and policy documents and long sessions to craft reporting lines that are resistant to interference. The company hires an external auditor to oversee technology governance for a period. Contracts are rewritten, not to punish, but to clarify and enforce accountability. In the middle of it all, Sophia and Carlos remain a small, steady presence. They continue to share dinners in the modest apartment, where the walls are lined with family photos and a few framed newspaper clippings from the donation event that started everything. Maria cooks and calls the neighbors to celebrate modestly. A few empanadas, coffee, and the kind of laughter that has weathered years of tighter months. At home, Sophia sits with her mother and her father figure, hands folded around a warm mug. There is a softness in the evening. Neighbors stop by, teachers whose grants were restored, a cafeteria worker who brings a single slice of cake, kids who look at Sophia like a cousin who solved a puzzle. They talk not about fame, but about trust. Carlos tells a story he has told since she was small. "When you sweep, you find what people forget," he says, and everyone smiles because the phrase is now a slogan for the new program at the company. The legal case grinds on in the background. Marcus is arraigned. The details of prosecution are left to the courts. Sophia is not a witness in a way that makes headlines. She is, instead, a person who provided evidence and did what she could to protect others. The law moves on its own timeline, and the company's reforms move on theirs. Months later, the mentorship program that Richard had promised begins to show results. A young administrative assistant moves into a project role. A custodian gets promoted to facilities supervisor with a seat on the safety committee. The scholarship fund pays out its first grants. People who had been invisible to the prior system stand taller, not because they are in the spotlight, but because the system now notices them. For Sophia, the most meaningful change is not awards or titles, but the redesign of a single process. A channel that allows workers at any level to send a secure report directly to the Oversight Committee. It is a small technical shift with big ethical consequences. It means someone who notices a pattern, no matter how small, will be taken seriously. It is the practical application of Carlos's belief that the people who keep the lights on deserve respect. There are quiet reconciliations, too. Richard reaches out to Carlos privately and asks for advice about how to run the mentorship program. The two men speak often now. Richard listens to the stories Carlos tells about work, about community, about the children who study after school under a single bare bulb. He brings those stories to the board with the earnestness of someone who knows the stories now carry weight. Sophia grows in ways that surprise her. She continues to study, to solve puzzles, to learn the angles of persuasion and the responsibilities of power. She chooses to spend more afternoons at the community center than at board meetings, teaching math to kids who cluster around the same table where she once did homework. She resists being called a prodigy in headlines. She prefers to be called persistent. One late afternoon after a long meeting about program rollouts, Sophia and Carlos walk home together. The city is golden. They pass the corner store where neighbors shout hello. They stop by a playground where children chase one another in the kind of chaos that promises nothing and everything. A small boy runs up to Sophia, holds out a pencil, and asks, "Can you show me how to do the trick with the numbers?" She kneels, and for a moment the world reduces to a single table and a single excited face. Carlos watches her with a softness that the cameras had once captured but could never fully translate. "You did what you had to do," he says. She looks at him. "We did," she answers. She knows the truth of the pronoun. The story is not hers alone. It never was. It was shared across lives, across long nights and modest kitchens, across a man who opened doors and another who kept the streetlights burning. It was shared across the decision to listen. In the months that follow, when journalists ask Sophia how she could do what she did at 12, she says something that does not fit neatly into a soundbite, but holds more substance than any headline. "I paid attention. I had people around me who taught me to care about the things others take for granted. That's the difference." Her answers are brief. They are honest. She returns to teaching and to homework and to the quiet pleasures of being a kid who happens to hold adult responsibilities. The company stabilizes. The market moves on. Investors recalibrate. The scars from the outage remain, not as trophies, but as lessons etched into policy manuals and into the memory of a staff meeting. There are losses. Some partners choose not to return, and a few reputations suffer. But a culture that once tolerated the silencing of small voices begins to care about what it hears. On the day the first scholarships are handed out, the company holds a small ceremony in a modest hall. Children from different neighborhoods line up awkwardly to collect envelopes. Maria stands near the back, proud in a way that is warm and private. Carlos stands beside her with a new ID badge and a dust mote of paint on his sleeve. Richard watches from the front row with his hands folded. Sophia, in the middle, hands out envelopes and high-fives the children with a grin that is all ease. After the ceremony, they walk home through the neighborhood that had once seemed a world away from boardroom windows. Someone hands Sophia a plate of food. Someone else calls her name and waves. She thinks of the nights she spent bent over a laptop, not because she wanted recognition, but because she believed that truth had to be preserved. She thinks of the small dignity in the way people greeted one another on this block. She thinks of Carlos telling her that the world remembers those who remember others. The narrative that began with panic in a frozen conference room ends, not with a neat cinematic resolution, but with the quieter, truer work of rebuilding. The company's oversight committee meets monthly. The scholarship fund publishes its recipients. The mentorship program produces its first hires. The janitorial team receives a raise and a new schedule that allows for stability and health care. As for Marcus, the legal case proceeds. There are hearings. There are settlements and consequences. The system of accountability does its work. It is no place for triumphalism. It is a place where consequences are meted according to law. The story's focus, intentionally, moves away from his downfall and toward what his exposure made possible. In the evenings, when the city slows and the windows of the tower faintly glow like an answered question, Sophia and Carlos sit on their small stoop with a steaming cup of tea. Neighbors pass. Some stop to talk about school, about rent, about children. They speak plainly and without fanfare. The world continues to spin. The program continues to fund scholarships. The oversight committee continues to meet. Sophia looks up at the tower where the company lives and feels both the weight and the warmth of her adopted connection to it. She is, legally, Richard Sterling's daughter. She is also the daughter of a woman who taught her to measure gratitude in small acts, and of a man who taught her the dignity of honest labor. She carries both truths without contradiction. At the end of one long day, she tucks a stray lock of hair behind her ear and says, "Look for the people who do the small, steady things. Listen when they speak." It is not advice only for corporate leaders. It is advice for anyone who ever assumed that importance was always visible. And for those who wonder what they can do, notice, preserve, speak truth with care, protect what matters. If Sophia inspired you, tap like and tell us about an overlooked hero in your life.